This project was released as part of the project InclusiveGameLab, which was funded by the German Ministry of Research, Technology and Space, and realized by the University of Applied Sciences Cologne and the Department for Youth Media Culture. So, you've decided to revise an existing project to make it more accessible, or better yet, you want to make something accessible from the ground up. That's great. But you're probably wondering where and how to even start. You might even feel overwhelmed with the plethora of ideas and recommendations that exist nowadays. First, we'd like to reassure you that it's perfectly normal to feel overwhelmed. And here's the good news. You've come to the right place to take your first steps into this very complex but fascinating topic. In this talk, we'll have a first look at the different approaches to accessibility and the unique challenges and opportunities they involve. There's a good chance you've already come into contact with accessibility guidelines, or at least heard of them. In the last 2 decades, the topic of accessibility has garnered growing attention in the game industry, and subsequently more and more such guidelines have been introduced. That's wonderful, of course, but it also means that it's easier than ever to get lost in this abundance of information. So instead of presenting the guides that are available and how to use them, we will first discuss why they actually might not be suitable for your purposes, and instead examine alternatives. However, you'll find links to the most popular guidelines in the further reading section at the end of this talk. Most contemporary guidelines are subdivided into different disability categories, for example, motor-related or sensory-related impairments, and offer a range of options to essentially compensate for individual shortcomings, like colorblindness, deafness, or reduced mobility. While considering how to accommodate different players and offering options is great, this approach has 3 major flaws. First, it draws on the medical model of disability, which defines disability as a medical condition. It focuses on individual deficiencies that have to be mitigated through accessibility accommodations. But as you already know from the introductory talk on disability, this is a rather outdated concept and usually not supported by people with disabilities and disability organizations. We, the InclusiveGameLab team, prefer the social model, which defines disability as a mismatch between an individual and their environment. Second, disabilities come in many different forms, and 2 individuals may need completely different accessibility options, even if they belong to the same disability group. This is complicated further when players have multiple impairments and the offered solutions for each impairment are in conflict with each other. For example, a hearing-impaired autistic person. A guideline may recommend to offer more information through visual channels to make up for the information that cannot be conveyed through sound. But it's very common among autistic individuals to experience sensory overload when they are facing too many or too intense stimuli, so that added visual information may actually become a problem for them. In short, players with disabilities are an incredibly diverse user group, and there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. And finally, as you learned in the introduction talk as well, accessibility can be beneficial not only for players with impairments, but also for able-bodied users. But by framing options as accessibility accommodations for a specific user group with medical conditions, game developers may be led to believe that they are only useful for this particular target group and decide that it's not relevant or not worth the effort. In addition, guidelines can be difficult to apply to an individual project for a range of reasons. Accessibility features are often tied to specific games or game types, so translating them to other projects can be a challenge, if not sometimes impossible. That means it might be difficult for you to figure out if something is a good fit for your particular project. Maybe certain options are actually not necessary because of built-in accessibility. Maybe what is labeled as easy to implement is actually much more challenging due to certain unique characteristics of your game. So while guidelines are helpful for examining and evaluating the accessibility of existing games or games that are in the later stages of development, they might not be the best way to start your accessibility journey. Making good games requires a lot of careful consideration. That doesn't only apply to balancing game mechanics, finding the visual language of your game, or creating sound that breathes life into virtual worlds. It's also crucial when you are trying to make your game more accessible. This is why considering accessibility from the get-go usually works best. It will be an integral part of your game, carefully tied into every part of it. Meanwhile, if you add accessibility at a later stage, it has to be embedded into existing structures, and usually guidelines do not provide any or sufficient advice on how to achieve this. Delivering satisfactory, or better yet, engaging and existing user experiences requires much more than just providing access. Another challenge is the aforementioned abundance of information. Guidelines have become more and more comprehensive over the years, and while that means you'll be able to find suggestions for many different use cases, it may also lead to confusion. Especially because guidelines, while increasingly complex, are often highly generalized. Some materials use difficulty categories as a foundation to guide developers, but once you access one, you'll still likely be greeted by an overwhelming amount of information, most of which may not even be relevant to you. This is why our open educational resources are structured differently. First, we've decided not to use disability groups. Instead, we have difficulty categories which were evaluated by experienced game developers. In these categories, you'll find very specific suggestions for various game development disciplines, specifically game design, game art, programming, and sound. In addition, each of the 3 levels offers short inputs with information for all people working in game development. Also, the suggestions we provide are carefully curated. That means the advice you'll find in these materials are by no means comprehensive, but less likely to be overwhelming and confusing. Speaking of disconnects from reality, technology advances at an incredible pace, and game technology is no exception. This is why guidelines, unless they are constantly updated, run the risk of being old news and not provide the guidance actually necessary to make modern games accessible. Of course, that's also true for the materials you are currently accessing, but the great advantages of open educational resources is that they can be modified and shared by everyone, which makes keeping them up to date much easier. Studies on the gaming behavior of players with disabilities have shown that there is often a disconnect between so-called best practices, as they are described in guidelines, and lived experiences. Most importantly, gamers with disabilities often figure out ways to use technology deemed inaccessible or use accessibility options not intended for them specifically. There's still a disconnect between industry practices and these target groups, which is why it's even more important in this context to approach players, do extensive play tests, and ideally involve gamers with disabilities in game development. You'll find detailed advice on how to do that in the intermediate talk for all disciplines, how to involve disabled gamers. To get a better understanding of how people with disabilities play games and which challenges they face, check out our introductory talk and the video statements. In addition, you can hire disability consultants to guide you. Ideally, they should be involved in every step of the development process and thus be a core part of your workforce. But if that's not possible, there's also the option of working with freelance consultants. In our resources, you will find a list of people and organizations to reach out to and to talk to, focusing on these topics. These are some sources and links for further reading.